How quickly the misery and destruction of war has spread across Ukraine as Russia seeks to impose its brutal will on the country. But is the conflict now entering its most critical phase? The question to Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former Commander, United States Army Europe, and my guest this week from Frankfurt.
This is going to be, that's why I mean it's going to be a decisive week ahead on whether or not we can force the Russians to culminate so that they can no longer attack.
The targeting of civilians and residential areas prompted General Hodges to call for NATO to impose a no-fly zone across Ukraine, but the alliance said no. Was this weakness or wise tactics? And what of Moscow's continuing threats to use nuclear weapons?
So it's almost like we are talking ourselves out of taking more forceful actions that we should.
All that and much more on Conflict Zone. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, welcome to Conflict Zone.
And thank you.
Can we start with the recent Russian attack on the Yavoriv military base close to the Polish border with Ukraine? 35 people died. This came after Russia had warned that NATO weapons shipments to Ukraine would be seen as legitimate targets. We don't, of course, know if some of those shipments passed through that base, but looking at the proximity of the attack to a NATO border, how serious is that for the alliance, do you think?
Well, I'm more concerned about the impact on the facility at Yavoriv. This is a training center that from the Soviet times that we, the U.S. Army and Canada, invested a lot of money over the last 6 or 7 years to turn it into a meaningful training area, training center for Ukrainian forces. And that's what it was for over the last several years. I don't know that it has become a logistics hub or anything. I think the Pentagon has been pretty closed-mouthed about this. But I mean, going after that base also is a demonstration that the Russians still have the capability to reach that far. And I imagine they also intended this as a warning.
And a warning or an actual attempt to pull NATO directly into the war? Do you think that's what they want to do?
I do not think that they want to get NATO into the war. That's the last thing that they want is a situation where you've got all 30 nations plus against Russia. I think this is more about them trying to interdict the logistical lines of communication.
Do you think NATO will continue to supply military assistance to Ukraine, and will it defend those shipments if necessary, directly?
Well, for sure, we're going to continue, and in fact, we've got to accelerate. We need to be doing something on the scale of the Berlin airlift with a sense of urgency. The next 10 days are decisive, in my view. The next 10 days, if we accelerate and expand the delivery of support, I think the Russians actually are close to culminating, to reaching the point where they can no longer continue the attack if we keep the pressure on them for the next 10 days.
There's a lot of focus on China right now. The US is claiming Russia has asked Beijing for military help. Potentially a huge development, that, isn't it?
Now, this is important. The Chinese have to decide what they want their role in the world to be. The Russians obviously are in trouble. They know it. Not only are they recruiting Syrians to come join the fight because their own manpower shortage is growing increasingly severe, and they need financial help, which is why they're turning to China. And I think they're looking for some material support as well. So China really has an opportunity and an important decision to make.
But the possibility of an open military alliance between the world's largest country geographically and the world's most populous nation, do you think NATO has even considered such an alarming development?
There's no doubt the alliance has been thinking about this. This featured prominently over the past year in a lot of the strategic thinking and the conversations.
Does it scare you?
No, because I just don't think it's. I don't think it's going to happen. Actually, there's not much advantage for China in being handcuffed to a Russia that is going to be destitute and without a friend in the world. Other than energy for its own economy and easier access through the Arctic, I don't see too many advantages for China here. This is bad for business for them.
General Hodges, on the ground in Ukraine, the battle for Kiev seems to be gathering momentum. Is this going to decide the outcome of this war?
I think that the Russians are not going to be able to encircle Kiev, let alone capture it. I mean, look, for almost 19 days now, they've been trying to capture Mariupol. That should have been the easiest city for them to capture, given the proximity of their navy in the Sea of Azov, forces there in Crimea and in Donbass, and yet they still have not been able to capture Mariupol. I don't believe that that they have the ability to actually encircle Kiev. I was there 5 weeks ago. I've been there several times. This is a very, very large city on the banks of one of the largest rivers in Europe. Very complex urban terrain. They don't have the manpower to encircle it.
But the failure, if Russia failed to take Kiev, that would be a catastrophic blow to them, wouldn't it? Won't they have orders? Won't they have orders to keep on regardless, flatten the city if necessary, take it at all costs?
There's no doubt that they will continue to launch rockets and missiles into Kiev the way they've done other Ukrainian cities, which is why it's so important that the aid that we are providing to Ukraine include the capability to destroy the rocket launchers and missile launching systems that Russians are using. But this is going to be, that's why I mean it's going to be a decisive week ahead on whether or not we can force the Russians to culminate so that they can no longer attack. And then Ukraine has a more advantageous position for whatever sort of negotiations are happening.
You clearly want NATO to do more to help Ukraine than it's been doing. Last week, you co-signed an open letter calling for the alliance to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine. To avert and deter Russian bombardment, you said more must be done to prevent more wide-scale casualties and a potential bloodbath. Do you feel NATO's been too soft?
I think that we are overreacting to Russian threats about expansion of the war, about nuclear weapons. I don't believe that the Kremlin will use a nuclear weapon. I don't, first of all, Putin cannot do it by himself. And I don't believe that the people around him are actually interested in this becoming a nuclear threat. So it's almost like we are talking ourselves out of taking more forceful actions that we should. We are talking too much about what we can't do and what we won't do, and not enough about what we can do. Look, Srebrenica, July 1995, European troops under a United Nations mandate stood outside the city while Republika Srpska forces murdered 8,000 Bosnian men and boys. I do not want us to be a part of something like that again.
Your letter said NATO leaders should make clear that they won't countenance Russian attacks on civilian areas, but they have countenanced them and they continue to do so. And they turned down your proposal for the no-fly zone. Does that concern you? That really they're ceding the advantage to the Russians here?
Yeah, and obviously I'm not a very compelling writer. I do feel like that we have lost some momentum. The first 2 weeks of this, I thought the White House was doing a terrific job. The allies sticking together, and we're still sticking together. But the last 4 days, it feels like we began to become more risk averse, more cautious, and the messaging was more about no escalation and less about stopping the murder of thousands of innocent Ukrainians.
But there's an awkward dilemma here for NATO, isn't there? NATO has to do what's right for NATO. It can't necessarily do what's right for Ukraine at the same time. The two aren't necessarily the same, are they?
I don't know that I accept the premise of the question. You're right, Ukraine is not a NATO member, and the alliance exists for the collective defense of all of its members. But if you accept the notion that what's happening in Ukraine is not limited to Ukraine. And I don't mean a stray missile going over the border. I'm talking about what Putin is doing. What is the impact on Europe, stability and security in Europe? Then I think NATO has to take a broader view of this.
Joe Biden has repeatedly felt the need to state publicly that the US won't directly intervene against Russian forces in Ukraine. He did so again last Friday. Is Biden pushing back against domestic pressure for him to do more? And if so, would you suspect that pressure is coming partly from inside the Pentagon?
Actually, the Pentagon is usually the most conservative institution in Washington, so I don't think he's getting too much pressure from the Pentagon to do more. Obviously, the Joint Staff and the Department of Defense are doing what they should do: prudent planning, anticipation of requirements, and giving the president options. But I don't think he's getting pressure from the Pentagon. The Congress seems to be in a bipartisan way in favor of doing a lot more. I think that the president has overstated this business about, no, we're not going to do this because it's as if it's automatically going to be World War III. I don't know that I agree with that.
Biden has delivered a strong warning about chemical weapons, saying Russia would pay a severe price if it used them. That's an easy threat to make. How seriously do you take it coming from Biden? I mean, Biden was vice president when Barack Obama gave a similar red line warning to Syria, which did use chemical weapons, but the warning never turned into action. Could it be the same this time round?
I would think not. You're right that President Biden was vice president during the Obama administration when this famous red line was given to the Assad regime. The Assad regime jumped right over it with Russian help, and the US, the UK, France, Germany did nothing. And I think that emboldened the Russians to go ahead and be even more aggressive. So that's why President Biden has not said this is a red line, because that figure of speech, you box yourself in. I would anticipate, though, that there would be consequences that would be even more severe for the Kremlin, although we're running out of other things to do to them short of kinetic force.
But chemical weapons is part of their warfare doctrine, isn't it? I mean, they've used it specifically against their opposition figures like Alexei Navalny and some of those that they've attacked on foreign streets in Europe. A former US official at the National Security Council says Moscow accepts the use of chemical agents in warfare. The stakes for Putin are existential, he said. If that's one more tool he can throw at this thing, he will. Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, I agree with Fiona Hill's comments a few weeks ago when she was asked about this, and she said, oh, yes, he would. That doesn't mean he will, but certainly I think he would countenance this, even if it was not for state survival, but if it was necessary to accelerate the extermination of Ukrainians or to depopulate the area by getting Ukrainians on the road. The most likely scenario with chemical weapons is probably something like Syria, chlorine, not something like a nerve agent. Chlorine still kills people, but the casualty rate probably is somewhere similar to rockets, artillery. But it puts things in a different category. And certainly, the idea of seeing kids and old people murdered by any kind of chemical weapon, any kind of gas, is going to put immense pressure on the administration and other heads of state and government to take action. And it should.
And those who will be most worried about the threat of chemical weapons would be Eastern Europe, Baltic states. They've been warning about Russian aggression in the region for some time. The question is why nobody's been listening to their voices over the years.
Well, I think that there is a large part of Western Europe that is further away from Russia, but also inside the United States and inside UK, where you've got huge Russian money, business, energy dependencies. So there's been a reluctance to confront this for a variety of bad reasons. And I would say shame on everybody that said, come on, Russia's not going to do this. I live in Frankfurt. I hear it from friends all the time before this happened. Come on, what are you worried about? It makes no sense. Putin would never attack. And here we are. And unfortunately, in the real world, you can't make your threats go away by looking the other way or wishing that they didn't exist. And so we're paying the price for that now.
To date, NATO's reinforcements in those countries don't have too much deterrent value, do they? A few thousand extra troops, a few more fighter aircraft, not nearly enough, is it?
Well, first of all, I would completely disagree with you, Tim, that they don't have much deterrent effect. That it's been pretty effective so far. But I do agree with you that we don't have enough. We don't have enough air and missile defense. We don't have enough logistics. The ability to move quickly across Europe is not what it needs to be to really be a strong deterrent should Russian forces move into Belarus in stronger numbers, which I expect is going to happen thanks to this bogus constitutional referendum in Belarus a few weeks ago. Then this raises the risk for our allies in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So we do need to improve air and missile defense. We do need to improve the logistical preparations. But I would also say I think that the alliance is now going to consider more favorably permanent basing in Romania and Poland and Baltic countries, not just rotational forces. I would support that.
And what do you think the reaction from Russia would be?
Of course, they will complain about it, but in my view, they're in no position to complain. We did not have permanent basing in there since the NATO-Russia Founding Act because one of the provisions said no permanent basing, and so we adhered to that. But when the Russians abrogated the NATO-Russia Founding Act with their attack in Georgia and then of Ukraine, the alliance continued to live by that. It's obvious that our good faith effort has not been rewarded by good behavior by the Russians, and so we need to replace that naivety with some serious deterrence measures.
You talked earlier about wanting to stop Russia calling the shots, and it's about time that the NATO alliance called the shots. Should the West be setting the agenda instead of responding to Moscow's?
Well, first of all, they need to be feeling pain immediately and in a lot of different places. The sanctions are important. The effects are going to be felt for years to come. But as you know, sanctions take a while to really start delivering effect. Some inconveniences for Russians now, but the real pain is going to be felt in the coming months. To include, Russia probably will default on a $150 billion debt on loans because their economy is in tatters, and Aeroflot will not be able to fly anymore because they don't have repair parts. And so there's going to be serious impact in the coming months. But more immediately, we need to be doing two things, in addition, obviously, to providing aid to the Ukrainians that they need. Number one, we should be trying to reach every Russian family and tell them what's going on. There's a reason that the Kremlin has put a media blackout all over Russia, that social media does not allow people to understand what's happening. The older demographic in Russia, of course, is completely bought into state-run TV, but there's another part of the population, I don't think so. There are still thousands of Russians that have the courage to go out and protest. The woman that we all saw on Russian TV last night that jumped in behind the commentator with the sign saying, "Stop the war," this is there. On the 1st of April, 130,000 Russian families are required to send their son to be conscripts for the Russian army. If we could reach just 10 or 20% of that 130,000 and tell them to resist, to not send their son, I think that would send a shockwave across Russia, and that could really generate more domestic pressure. That's hard to do, but I think this is doable.
General Hodges, you've been pretty scathing about Europe's defense posture in the past. In your book, Future War, you say that Europe is finally waking up from a 30-year strategic slumber, but there's little unity of effort or purpose and even less strategic direction. Any sign that's changing in the last few days? The idea that the EU would actually ship weapons to Ukraine or anywhere else certainly speaks to a sudden awakening, doesn't it?
Yeah, I would say it's been quite an awakening. And Germany has been the key here. When Chancellor Scholz made his speech about 3 weeks ago there in front of the Bundestag, where he talked about 2%, he talked about the 100 billion euro and allowing weapons to move through Germany, or weapons over which Germany had some control. This was critical. That, to me, was the door slamming shut on any hope that Putin might have had to separate the alliance or to divide the U.S. from Europe. German leadership here is essential. Now, it's not just the economy, it's sort of the moral authority that Germany has accrued over the last 7 or 8 decades. And I think that German political leadership, the so-called elites, realized that they were in danger of seeing that credibility erode right underneath their feet. They could not claim to be the champion of European values and of the gesamte europäische Friedensordnung, the peace and stability culture of Europe,
Right.
if they stood by while Russia smashed it.
What's alarming in your judgment is the fact that while Russia is exploiting the evolution in military technology, hypersonic weapons, laser, particle beam systems, Europe, you say, has chosen not to. How serious is it that Europe should actually try to catch up with these advanced technologies?
Well, of course, if you want to defeat those technologies or deter their use against you, you have to demonstrate that you have the ability to do that. Now, stand fast the fact that the Russians have not been able to actually employ very effectively much of these technologies. I've been a little bit surprised that I have not seen more cyber use, that I have not seen more effective integration of their modern systems.
Did you overestimate their capabilities?
I did. I absolutely did. And I think as I look back, the missing ingredient, it's not the device, it's not the platform, it's the training and the culture of readiness. And I think what we're seeing is the result of decades of corruption and false reporting inside the Russian defense industry and inside the Ministry of Defense. A lot of money was spent, but they didn't get what they paid for.
You said recently the Kremlin is always in a war state of mind, but NATO isn't, is it? And it hasn't been. Can you now foresee NATO moving, excuse me, to the same kind of war footing as Russia? Does it need to?
I think we're going to see more people being more clear-eyed about the threat. I mean, you know, we probably, first of all, couldn't believe that there would be a big war in Europe. Secondly, we were accustomed to what war looked like in Afghanistan and Iraq, not with missiles flying into buildings and thousands of people being killed and displaced like we're seeing right now. So we had forgotten about the lethality of high-end of war. So I think there's a grim realization that if we want to prevent that, you have to be ready for it.
What comes next, in your view, as far as the battles are concerned in Ukraine? If Putin won't accept to lose and can't be seen to lose in the international arena, what do you think he would do? Is the West on a knife edge here?
I don't think so. I think we have taken too much counsel of our own fears about a nuclear conflict and allowed him to use threats to keep us from doing what needs to be done. I'm not saying that there's no risk, and obviously nobody I know wants it to go that way, but I think we have given him too much credit for the ability to do those things, and we've deterred ourselves. What comes next? If I'm right, that within the next 10 to 12 days, Russian forces culminate, they can no longer continue the attack. They will obviously want to hang on to what they've got. This is when we should be pouring it on. We'll have a better negotiating position, and we should demand that they go back to not just pre-February 24, but what President Biden said, that Ukrainian sovereignty is a priority for the United States, that they should leave Crimea, they should leave the Donbass, and then we get on with recovery. I mean, there's going to be more than 3 million refugees that want to come home. This is going to be a massive problem to rebuild and help repatriate people. But also, as you and your viewers know, there are millions of people across Europe and the Middle East that depend on grain from Ukraine for food. We're going to have a serious food problem here over the next year until Ukraine is able to start exporting agriculture again.
And the humanitarian emergency that's now a very real, a very all-present reality for people in the major cities. People are living in what one aid agency called apocalyptic conditions. We just stand by and watch that for the time being?
No, of course not. There are dozens and dozens of agencies that are out already trying to help, uh, particularly in Poland, where agencies have moved there to help deal with refugees. And some are working inside Ukraine. I know several people who are personally involved in this. Um, but there's also going to be a part of the cleanup. As you know from all your years as a journalist, in a conflict like this, there is so much what we call UXO, unexploded ordnance, everywhere. The cluster munitions that the Russians have used, rounds that did not detonate. This stuff is lying all over the battlefield everywhere. And so as people go back in and try to clean up these cities, this is going to be a real problem for quite some time. And also these nuclear plants. I mean, we've got some cleanup to do there as well.
All right, General Hodges, it's been good to have you on Conflict Zone. Thanks very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
Thanks for the privilege, Tim.